Okay, what I've decided to do today is to kind of really double back here and go through some English history and trace it all the way to the British colonies here in the Americas. And along the way, I want to show the intersection of the political evolution of things in both the religious and the intellectual elements that all combine to create a narrative of history. And I think the English, since we're closest to them in terms of these older nations that have gotten us to the point where we are in terms of world history, I think the English experience kind of best illustrates that whole process. Now, until the Norman conquest in 1066, England had been conquered by a series of different groups. Of course, the Roman Empire, Rome held strong into England almost till the very end. And one of the things about the legendary King Arthur was that perhaps he was an attempt to restore the law and order that had been in place in the Roman Empire. After the fall of Rome, like the rest of the Roman Empire, they were invaded by a group of various different barbarians. First the Angles, and then the Saxons. In fact, the Saxons were brought in to help fight the Angles, and then basically turned on the English, sided with the Angles, and created Anglo-Saxon England. And going here to the document camera, you can see here that you had the English kingdom of Wessex, then Mercia, and then up here in Northumberland, and then Scotland to the north of that. So you had these various remnants of these barbarian kingdoms that existed. And then in the 900s, for about 100 years, the Vikings had a large deal of control in England. So it was kind of like a trampled upon entity until William the Conqueror. William actually was descended from a Viking, Rollo, who had been given the westernmost portion of France, Normandy. That's where William the Conqueror and the Normans come from. And eventually they became assimilated into French culture. And William inherited the throne in kind of a mess in his early life. But once he settled in and got things organized, he decided that he was going to invade England. Now, the invasion of England was he had a claim to the throne, and then Harold Hardrada also had the same claim. They both had kind of dubious claims, but there wasn't any good direct kind of lineage. So basically, in the Middle Ages, you settled that with a battle. Now, Harold had a problem. He had to take on another usurper here on the 20th of September, and then another battle on the 25th of September. William, as you can see here, lands on the 28th of September, and Harold has to make a long, rapid move here to be able to challenge William. And they fight at the Battle of Hastings here in 1066, October of 1066. And actually, Harold's forces had the better of it. William had the difficult tasks of an amphibious invasion, bringing his supplies with him, bringing his army, getting it organized, etc. But late in the afternoon, Harold gets shot in the eye with an arrow and subsequently dies. And with the absence of his leadership, resistance collapses, and you have the beginnings of Norman England. And 1066 is the last time that England was invaded. So this Norman invasion is a history-altering sort of thing for Anglo-Saxon England. So this kind of just sets the background. What I want to get into now is the the political evolution of that. Now, William had a little problem when he arrived. He spoke French, and everybody else spoke English. And he also wanted to replace all the English nobility and replace it with his French Norman nobility. And for a couple hundred years, French was the language of the aristocracy, but eventually they were assimilated and became anglicized in custom, etc. But one of the first things William did was establish a system of taxation. And he did this by sending out agents who recorded all the property owned mostly by the nobility, who were the wealthiest, whom he could tax, and put them in charge of collecting taxes. The other issue was law, justice. And again, they being French, they decided that they would accede to the common law of the area in which a given noble would be ruled. And eventually this becomes the evolution of English common law, which 600 years later comes to be transferred to the what is now the United States, with the British colonies there in North America. So just wanted to establish that background. And this is an interesting kind of phenomena, because England is a monarchy, and as with all monarchies in Europe, they claim descent from Charlemagne. But England, beginning here early on in the process, differs from the monarchies in the rest of Europe. The rest of Europe, it was absolute or divine right, monarchy. That is, the king's word was law because the Pope had crowned Charlemagne, meaning God wanted Charlemagne and his descendants to rule, and therefore the king's word was law. England started in that direction, but this is where it is significant, is that England became a limited monarchy. And that didn't happen overnight. It was an evolutionary sort of thing. It really kind of begins with the acceptance of English common law rather than the imposition of some kind of a foreign law. But it really has its beginnings right here with the Magna Carta of 1215. And there it is. You can't read it, of course. It's in Latin, and it's in the various museums, the British Museum, the Tower of London, etc., there for all to see. Now, the Magna Carta was the result of a lot of different things. The King of England was Richard III. Or Richard the Lion-Hearted. Richard took the Pope's call for a crusade to heart and took off with an army of Englishmen heading for the Holy Land, where he did battle. Now, Richard was a pretty decent military man, had some success, but it cost money for him to carry this out. So his brother, John, the only king named John, had several things to take care of. He had to pay for the Crusades. And of course, how does he pay for them? He raises taxes on the nobility, who then have to collect it from the peasantry, but also pay off their fair share. But he also had another problem. War with France. Now, the war with France goes back to the the Norman invasion of 1066. William was Duke of Normandy, which meant he was the vassal of the King of France, but he was also simultaneously King of England. So, as the King of England and a major vassal of the King of France, he probably was the most powerful person in France. And the French nobility began to question this somewhat. And then when Philip Augustus, who also was supposed to go on the crusade with Richard III, got into an argument with Richard III, he went back to France, and then, sensing that Richard wasn't around, began a war with John. So John had to pay for the Crusades and a war with France. And unfortunately for John, Richard had taken the best soldiers with him, and John himself wasn't a particularly good military man. His nickname was John Softsword, in fact. And then, on his way back from the Holy Wars, from the Crusade, he was captured in the Holy Roman Emperor, held for ransom, and John had to raise money for that. So you can see here, it's tax upon tax upon tax, and the British are seeing no success. The English are seeing no success. They didn't really get much out of the Holy Land. They lost some territory in France, and now they had to ransom the king. So subsequently, the great nobles got together, and when John tried to raise the taxes, they met him at Runnymede near Windsor Castle. And John was defeated by his great nobles to it, and they forced him to sign the Magna Carta. Let me see if I can find some of the provisions here. And we'll go here to Magna Carta. Is that redundant now again? But, here we go, down here. These are the things that are going. This charter became the official law and is the beginning of the English Constitution in it. And one of the things that they insisted upon was the right of habeas corpus. And what habeas corpus stated was that you had to be charged within 24 hours of your arrest or set free. So none of this arresting people and keeping you in jail for a couple of years while you're trying to find and gather evidence of that. But the other big provision is that it provided for the regular calling of the English Parliament. It is the legislature of the Kingdom of England. Didn't have much power in the early years because it only came into session when the king called them into session. And he only did that if he needed to raise taxes. But this provision here, the habeas corpus, some other trial rights, plus Parliament, really is the beginning of the establishment of the limited monarchy here in England. See, I've been talking about the computer and not having it on here during that particular time. The Parliament comes from the French word parler, which means to talk. And basically, they would talk about. The nobles and the king would talk. The nobles knew what the king wanted. The king wanted more tax money. They would almost always give him that, but the king would have to make some small concession or other in order to get their acquiescence in that process. And over the course of time, from 1215 onward, for the next 400 years, you had a steady increase in the power of the parliament and a slow, steady erosion of the power of the king. And that doesn't become significant until later on. So, 1215, Magna Carta. Okay, that's the first step in this process. I'm going to go back here to the computer and double back because I want to make sure I don't skip anything here in the chronology. Okay, so you can see from this chart, these are limitations, small limitations, put on the king by the parliament as he calls them into session during important, whenever he wanted to raise taxes, etc. So, and then here you have a whole series of these laws, and in summary, these come to be what they call the English Constitution. What I wanted to find here was the next big statement here. This goes a little too fast. Try this. When I had gone through this earlier, I had found what I wanted, but now I don't. This is the beginning of real power sharing here under Henry III, and it is the model parliament. And in the model parliament, you had the nobles, but he also invited the knights and townsmen, also known as burghers or burgesses. What happened is the nobles refused to meet with the knights and townsmen, and this became the House of Lords. And this came to be the House of Commons. Now, what Henry was doing here was not anything out of the great magnanimity of his heart to increase the democratic process that went on in England. What he was doing was forming an alliance with the newly wealthy middle class that were evolving due to the Crusades, the growth of towns, etc. And what he was doing was pitting these guys against his nobles, and generally the House of Commons would side with the king against the House of Lords. Now, it took a while for Commons to get a real foothold here, but they became a very, very important part of the political process that went on. Now, There's a back and forth sort of movement here over time in England, with kings sometimes gaining a little more power, sometimes Parliament gaining a little more power. But in general, there's a slow, steady erosion in his power to the negative effect of Parliament, or excuse me, of himself, and an increase in the hands of Parliament. So the next major thing to go to, I'm gonna get off of this. And here we have the War of the Roses. I know this was a movie with Dustin Hoffman. I forget who the female lead was, but the War of the Roses was a series of battles, as you can see, from 1455 through 1487. That was fought between two rival claimants, the House of Lancaster and the House of York. One symbol was the yellow rose, the other was the white rose, and therefore that became the War of the Roses. As you can see, England's a mess here. They just came out of the 100 Years' War, where they lost all of their territory in France, and now they have this nasty little set of battles that really leaves the country kind of in chaos here. I'm not going to go through all the details of it, but the House of York loses the Civil War, and Henry VII of the House of Lancaster becomes the victor and claims to be the crown, the King of England. He then marries the daughter of Richard III. Now, why does he do that? Because it ends the cause for the Civil War. Because now the inheritor of the throne will be from both sides of the disputed crownship, if you will, and then there's no reason for a war. They're descended both from Lancaster and from York. So, and here we have the House of Tudor. Henry VII is the first Tudor king. Oops, I didn't go through this. Here we have, this is the Tudor dynasty. Henry VII is first, then Henry VIII, and then we move on down. As we've just said, Henry comes to the throne by defeating Richard IV at the last battle of the War of the Roses, and then marries into the family so that the descendant Henry VIII, who succeeds him, comes from the both houses that fought in the war. Now, the Tudors are extremely significant historically. They don't have a really long period of time where they rule. Beginning in 1485, you've got Henry VII. He is succeeded by Henry VIII, who we'll spend some time talking about. And Henry's important in the history and evolution of democracy, but he's also very, very important in terms of what we've just been talking about in the last lecture, the Protestant Reformation. He is succeeded by his son Edward VI. He is succeeded by his half-sister Mary I, and then finally the greatest of English rulers, Elizabeth I. And she is the last of the Tudors. She goes, I think, 1558 to 1603. I think that's the length of her reign. But the Tudors are very shrewd in how they handle Parliament. They recognize that they need Parliament in order to govern, and they're pretty frugal. So being frugal, they don't need to go to Parliament a lot for money, which means, in effect, they don't have to be making concessions and having their power diminish. The Tudors were probably the strongest of the medieval, early modern monarchs in England, and ruled to a large extent without really strong influence or input by Parliament. The biggest contribution that Henry made, other than national unity, he was the first English king to recognize that since they were an island, if they were going to be able to protect themselves, defend themselves, etc., that they needed a large navy in this regard. And what's interesting is he comes to power in 1485. 7 years later, Columbus arrives in the Americas. The very interesting thing is in 1497, just 5 years later, Henry VII sends out John Cabot. His real name was Cabottini, another Italian navigator, to head west. And Cabot goes down. He runs smack dab. He makes has good, very favorable winds, runs smack dab into Canada, and then goes down the coast all the way down to the Carolinas, claiming that land for England. Now, that land had already been claimed by the Spanish, and of course, you know what that means, that eventually in the European tradition, there's going to be a war that's going to take place. So, yeah, 1497, John Cabot makes his claim to the Americas, and Henry does build up his navy. Parliament goes along with it because they recognize inherently the wisdom of that. Next, we come to a very significant guy, Henry VIII. Henry VIII was the second son of Henry VII. His brother Andrew was to be the king. Andrew, I think, died of smallpox, and Henry was to assume the throne. Little interesting sidelight is that Henry married his brother Andrew's widow, and this was Catherine of Aragon. And you can tell from her name, she is from Spain. So this was a political marriage, kind of allying England and Spain against their mutual enemy, France. And things go on well. But as both Henry and his wife age, there is a failure to produce a male heir. And Henry is very cognizant, and his advisors are very cognizant, that the lack of a male heir could end up in civil war, another War of the Roses, and none of them wanted that. Now, interestingly enough, when Martin Luther first came out with his 95 Theses, Henry very vehemently attacks him and assails him and swears his allegiance to the papacy in Rome. And this remains to be the case for much of Henry's reign. During that time period, he rejects Calvinism. Now, the interesting thing here is while England remains Catholic, Scotland becomes Calvinist under the leadership of John Knox, who is an early Calvinist leader. So they very quickly go from Catholicism, and in some cases paganism, to Calvinism, that very strict literal interpretation of Scripture, etc. Henry vehemently defends against that. Let me see here. I'm going to diverge here again because this always comes up with Henry. And here's what I was looking for here. Henry didn't have 8 wives, even though the drinking songs indicate that he had 8 wives. And of course, you could get away with it because the song's supposed to be a joke, and it's not about Henry VIII. It's about a woman who has 8 husbands named Henry. But in reality, they were poking fun of Henry's marriages. And there's a little rhyme, easy rhyme to remember it. It's divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. Catherine of Aragon, he was married to her for 24 years. Anne Boleyn, 3 years. Jane Seymour, 1. Now, Jane Seymour did have a child, and that was Edward VI, but she died shortly after childbirth. Next was Anne of Cleves. He was married to her for less than a year. He married her sight unseen. When she arrived in England, he couldn't stand her, and he divorced her very quickly. Catherine Howard got caught up in some palace intrigues and was beheaded. And then finally, Catherine Parr here, who he was married to for 4 years, survived him. So really, Catherine of Aragon he was married to for most of his life, 24 years. Between 1553 and 1547, only 14 years, he goes through 5 more wives, 2 of whom he beheads. And this is where the joke comes in about Henry. But again, divorced, beheaded, survived, divorced, beheaded. No, she died, and this is the one, Catherine Parr, who survived. The names aren't real different. A couple Catherines, a couple Annes, and a Jane in there. So those are the wives of Henry VIII. But the real significance comes is in that divorce from Catherine of Aragon. Now, this is a problem because he's going to now have a problem with Spain, and that problem with Spain just continues to get worse over time. But generally, the Catholic Church frowns upon divorce, but they would also, through legal channels, negotiations, etc., and of course probably a hefty donation to the church, eventually grant the divorce. Because what Henry wanted was what he eventually got was the male heir to the throne. But the papacy, Charles V showed up in Rome, and he happened to be Catherine's uncle. And so the Pope, during these wars that were going on, decided it wasn't in his best interest to give Henry a divorce from Charles V's niece, and so he refused to it. So what Henry did was in 1535, he had Parliament pass the Act of Supremacy. Okay? And the Act of Supremacy of 1535 said the head of the Church of England was not the Pope, but the King of England. Okay, now, Henry is very different than the other Protestants. In fact, he's not really protesting anything except not getting the divorce he wants. He's not a Lutheran justification by faith guy. He's not a Calvinist, literal interpreter of Scripture kind of guy. He's a pragmatic politician. He wants to, what he sees as take the steps necessary to prevent a civil war after his death and get a divorce and produce a male heir. So what the Act of Supremacy does, it merely replaces who's giving the orders in terms of how the church is organized, and Parliament goes along with this. Most of it does anyway, because they are going to benefit economically. How are they going to benefit? All of those churches and bishops that owe their allegiance to Rome were going to lose their property, lose their tithes, etc., and all of those would now go to bishops appointed by Henry's handpicked head of the church, which is the Archbishop of Canterbury. Henry's the head of it. But the Archbishop of Canterbury is in charge of the day-to-day operations. And with Henry's approval, he appoints the bishops, lands, etc. And so Henry's break with Rome is really without a whole lot of fanfare. Now, there's a number of Catholics in England who really don't want to go along with it, but basically, Henry leaves them alone. As long as they aren't going to protest too heavily against what he has done, he's not going to bother them, persecute them, etc. But he does favor those who join the Church of England as opposed to remaining in the Roman Catholic Church in that time period. Here's the other thing. He doesn't change the religious practices very much. The Mass is said in English instead of Latin, and that's a pretty significant change. But he basically keeps things the same. And today, the Church of England is, in the United States, is the Episcopalian Church. So, Henry doesn't do much, and it's a relatively smooth transition. The last 14 years where he's going through wives, beheading a couple of them, etc., is a cause for concern. And then there is a little problem with Edward VI. He's too young. I think he's like 10 when Henry dies, and so he is under the control of adult regents, and he's in bad health, and he dies relatively young. I think he was about 16 when he died, but he was a staunch Protestant Anglican like his father. But he is succeeded by his half-sister Mary. Now, Edward VI, as we said, is Catherine Howard's child. Anne Boleyn has a child, that's Elizabeth, but Mary is the older of the two sisters, and she is the daughter of Catherine of Aragon. And so, when she comes in, her 5-year reign, she attempts to return England to the Protestant fold, or the Catholic fold, excuse me, and her historical nickname is Bloody Mary. Not very popular in England. She dies after a 5-year reign, and in comes Elizabeth, who's the daughter of Anne Boleyn. That is the woman that Henry divorced Catherine of Aragon for in order to have a male child. Didn't work out, and then this kind of maybe informs a little bit about Elizabeth's personality here, is that she's about 7 years old when her mother is beheaded. The Tudors were extremely well educated. Most of them could speak 7 or 8 languages. They had tutors from very early in life, and they were all very, very, very bright, scholarly type individuals. But you can imagine that, Dad shows up one day and says, "Elizabeth, can I have a talk with you?" I had to chop Mom's head off. Now, it probably didn't quite happen that way, but it had to really toughened her mentally, emotionally, for those breaks that would occur. Now, during all of these reigns, not only did you have Catholics, you also had this group called Puritans. And the Puritans were Calvinists. Okay, the Calvinists the Puritans wanted to bring the Calvinist interpretation of the Protestant Reformation to England. Again, Henry and really, other than Mary, Edward and Elizabeth really had no desire to have that happen, but they also had no desire to persecute the members of their church. So basically it was kind of a don't ask, don't tell. If you guys don't come out and give us any trouble, we're not going to go run around looking into your churches to see how you're praying and how you're behaving, etc. Kind of no harm, no foul. But if you come out and start to challenge the authority, and Elizabeth was very strong on that, you were going to be executed for doing that. So England's kind of torn here in the 1500s. You've got a Catholic tradition, you've got the Anglican changeover, and then you've got these Calvinists who are more extreme in their religious belief, and they're called Puritans because they wanted to purify the Church of England of its Catholic beliefs that go on, that persisted under the way Henry ran the church. Now, Elizabeth, as you can see, a very stable 45-year reign here in there, and she is critical, important person within it. Early on, she made up her mind that she was not going to marry, that she was not going to be put in a position where she had to compromise either religiously or politically in the best interests of England. But this didn't keep her from leading some of the crowned heads of Europe that she might marry them. She must have told a dozen of them that she was considering marriage, and they would all send her elaborate gifts, which she never sent back, and ended up never marrying anyone. And here is one of the most well-known portraits of England, of Elizabeth. She was redhead, just like her father. And you can see the very elaborate dress, probably a gift from one of her many suitors. Well, one of her suitors was Philip II of Spain. This could have been a very formidable alliance with a combination of the British and the Spanish navies. But Elizabeth just was playing the game, and in her mind, she was going to do what was best for England. And marrying Philip was not in her, she didn't think that was in England's best interest. And this is Elizabeth's greatest success here, was in 1588, the defeat of the Spanish Armada. And in 1588, under the leadership of Elizabeth, now she didn't lead the sea battle. She had Sir Francis Drake do that for her. But this is the significant event, and it dominates for the next 300 plus years. Now, 1492. Begins 100 years of Spanish power. And without question, throughout the 14 and 1500s, Spain is the top dog. But after 1588, that is no longer true. An armada is simply a very large navy. And Philip II made a big mistake in that instead of putting an admiral in charge of the armada, he put a general in charge. And the game plan was they were going to sail into the English Channel, up the Thames River, land in England, take over, defeat England, probably force Elizabeth to marry him, and really become the dominant power. Well, two things happened. The general wasn't very good. Again, I forget to put the computer on. You were going to sail from Spain into the English Channel, down the Thames River, land, take over, win the land battle, and force Elizabeth into marriage. Instead, the general, who was put in charge of the armada, doesn't have great success. And Elizabeth had put Sir Francis Drake in charge. And he had become her favorite for a number of reasons. He was a privateer, and their nickname was they were Sea Dogs. And What the privateer Sir Francis Drake was fond of doing was, as the Spanish ships were coming here from the prevailing westerlies back to Spain loaded with gold and silver, Drake would attack the ships. He would shoot down the masts and then tow the ship back to England, take all the gold and silver out, and hold the crew for ransom. Now, that's piracy, but he wasn't a pirate, he was a privateer. What's a privateer? It's a pirate with a license. And who grants the license? The Queen. And so she got a cut of the tape. And Drake, on one of his raids, got trapped, and he is the second man after Magellan to completely sail around the world. To get away from the Spanish, he went around South America, across the Pacific, back around Africa, and back up into England. So he was the Queen's favorite. She put him in charge. She handled the Spanish pretty well in the Channel. Then a hurricane-like storm blows in, and the English retreat into their harbors. The Spanish can't, so they have to try to sail away from the storm. And as you can see here, they go up around England, and then they decide that they're going to perhaps invade Ireland. A second storm blows in, and by the time they get back to Spain, there's hardly any ships left. And so, 1588, this is the beginning of British supremacy on the oceans. And it retains that way. 1588, it doesn't end until 1918. What happens in 1918? It's the end of World War I, and they were on the winning side. But as Winston Churchill said, victory bought at so dear a price as to be indistinguishable from defeat. And the British supremacy on the high seas ended in 1918, and that's the stage at which the U.S. Post-World War reluctantly entered to fill the void. First, the Germans and the Japanese attempted to do so, but the U.S. eventually stepped into that particular void there. So, this is English history to this point, and it's important for the history of the United States, because now that the Spanish Armada is no longer a threat, the English are finally able to take advantage of Cabot's voyage and begin to settle in the areas that both he and the Spanish had claimed. That same land. It's the real reason for the battle with the Armada. Who's going to be, are the English going to be able to settle in North America and look for all that gold and silver, or are the Spanish going to have it all to themselves? Well, the defeat of the Armada settles that once and for all. The Spanish weren't going to be able to stop them. Oops, didn't get what I wanted there. Okay, the Stuarts have an interesting history here, and I'll put them up on the board here right now. So, Elizabeth dies in 1603, but she dies with England in great shape, ruling the oceans, ready to be set up for colonization, etc. But the Stuarts, James I, Charles I, Charles II, James II, William and Mary, and then the last of the Stuarts, Anne. And there's a real dividing line kind of here. the interesting thing about James I, who became King of England, he was James VI of Scotland and James I of England. His mother was Mary, Queen of Scots. She was a cousin of Elizabeth, and then there was a rebellion in Scotland against her reign, so she fled to England. Elizabeth took her in, and then she got caught up in a plot against Elizabeth, and of course, you know what happens there. She is beheaded. So, with Mary dies, or Elizabeth dies childless, her cousin James I, James VI of Scotland, James I of England, becomes King of England. And his nickname historically is the wisest fool in Christendom. But he is responsible for the King James Version of the Bible, the most common English example of the Bible. And the Stuarts were closet Catholics. Okay, they knew they had to give lip service to Anglicanism, etc., but they in reality had a strong penchant and preference for Catholicism in their background, and they were more in the tune of divine right than limited monarchs. But it just wasn't going to work for that time period. And in the period of James I, the Puritans become much more vocal because they recognize the inherent Catholicism of James I, and they started to protest publicly, etc. And of course, James, being authoritarian, comes down rather hard on them. Now, the Puritans here in the early 1600s had been around, about 60, 70 years. And a group of them finally just kind of gave up. They said, there's no way that we're going to purify this guy's church. He's harassing us, persecuting us, etc. And so the separatists said, we're just going to form our own separate Calvinist church. This is not greeted well by James, and they are forced to flee to the Netherlands, which had just recently become independent of Spain. And were a Protestant country there. They stayed there about 5 or 6 years. And decide that they have to leave. And they decide they have to leave the Netherlands. They slowly sneak back into England. They arranged for passage on a boat called the Mayflower, and this group of people, the Pilgrims, set sail for the colony of Virginia, the northern part of Virginia, which, as we know, is Massachusetts. But what these Pilgrims do is they set up a theocracy in Massachusetts. And again, we talked about this with John Calvin, and they are Calvinists. They are believers in literal interpretation of the Bible, etc. And they see England as hopeless and sinful, and so they're going to go to the Americas, and they're going to create the shining city on the hill, the New Jerusalem, the new promised land, and they're going to show the rest of the world how a proper and moral society should be. And they are free to do this because there is no other authority around them. And they manage to pull this off. Now, James I dies. He's succeeded by his son, Charles I. So Charles inherits these colonies as he goes on. But Charles has some real problems. The Petition of Right, it's a major English constitutional document that sets out specific liberties. It's passed by Parliament June 7, 1628, It comes with restrictions on non-parliamentary taxation, that is, don't try to tax us without asking us first. The forced housing of soldiers, violation of habeas corpus, etc. And so this is signed in the transition from James I to Charles I. Charles doesn't much like it, and as time goes on, he basically gets to the point where he provokes a civil war. Okay, let's switch up here. So, in addition to that, the evolution here, the model parliament, etc., the Tudors are able to keep Parliament at bay. The Stuarts, much conflict. And in this 1628 Petition of Right, represents a strengthening of the Magna Carta. Now, it's a 400-year gap in there, and there had been some improvements, etc., in the basic rights of Englishmen. But the 1628 Petition of Right puts it down in writing. Now, Charles, of course, got what he wanted. He got the tax increase. He wanted to fight a couple wars, but he then chooses to ignore the Petition of Right. And so this conflict that's going on with the Puritans continues. The Pilgrims are a small group. They leave in 1620. As we all know, 1621, they celebrated the first Thanksgiving. Now, just as an aside, in December 25th of 1621, the same year as the first Thanksgiving, here's the Christmas. What do the Pilgrims do on Christmas Day? They go to work because they don't believe in Christmas. They think it's a Catholic superstition. So, kind of an interesting little sidelight. Christmas doesn't get celebrated much until the huge Irish and German immigration of the 1800s in the United States. But now, because of Charles's actions, you have more and more of these Puritans coming to Boston and Salem, etc., and setting up, and this is called the Great Migration of Puritans out to there. The interesting thing is, when they leave, while they're theoretically under the control of the king, they're pretty much free to practice and do things as they will, and that's exactly what happens. Meantime, back at the ranch, the Protestants get organized, and they challenge the king to open warfare. Okay? And the two sides are the Cavaliers, as in the Cleveland Cavaliers, and the other side is the Roundheads. The Cavaliers were the royal forces. The Roundheads were the Puritans. They were called Roundheads because the fashion of the day for the nobility was extremely long hair. They had buzz cuts, so the Cavaliers called them Roundheads. Now, you would think that the king's forces would win, but there emerges here a genius, a military genius. Oliver Cromwell. And Oliver Cromwell, long story short, defeats the English forces, the royal forces, and forces Charles to capitulate. Charles agrees for a while and then secretly tries to depose Oliver Cromwell and the Puritans. Not a good idea. He's caught in the act, and he is the only English king to be beheaded. Charles I is beheaded in 1648. So, again, let's just talk about the English colonies because I'm going to come back to them in a little bit. What's going on over here? They're doing whatever they want. The English, they're fighting a civil war. They're fighting internal religious wars that goes on. And then when Cromwell comes in after the beheading of the king, he becomes basically a military dictator. And he rules, this is called the interregnum between kings. And he basically, about 1650 to 58, is the military dictator of England. Now, he is philosophically a Calvinist. And now he has control of the army, he has control of Parliament, and what he does is he imposes that very strict, austere Calvinism of Geneva, of John Calvin and Zwingli, etc. England is now solidly in control of the Calvinists, and what they do is, this is where their reputation comes from. They ban plays, they shut down the theaters. Shakespeare is no longer put on the stage. Cards are banned, loud clothes are banned, gambling, dancing, all of these things are prohibited during this time period. And so the Puritans get what they want here. But again, Cromwell is so busy enforcing these and attacking the Catholics in Ireland, their colonies in America are pretty much doing whatever they want to do. When Cromwell dies, his son tries to take over. Parliament says, and they call to Charles II, who is living in France, and this is called the Restoration. And Charles II, he recognizes what happened to his father. So he is going to get along as best he can with Parliament. Now let's just ask this question, because you can see how it's all tied together. You've got a Protestant revolution, an English civil war, a beheading of a king, etc. And now that process that began in 1215, by this point here, you're going to very clearly say that you're pretty close to even in terms of power between the king and between Parliament. And Charles II knows that. And so he gets along as well as he can and really begins the expansion of the British Empire that becomes the hallmark of the next couple hundred years of world history where it goes on. So, yep, I have to go back here and do. I want to do English restoration here. I guess I'll just have to erase it and do it this way. And here he is, Charles II. He had grown up in the court of Louis XIV rather, in France, and he dressed in the fashion of the day. As you can see, long hair, silk, notice silk stockings, high-heeled shoes. That was the fashion of the day. This is the sort of thing the Puritans couldn't handle very well. But what Charles did is he agreed to come back and become the King of England, replacing Cromwell in that military dictatorship, but he also clearly had to recognize the authority of Parliament. And you had a pretty solid 20-year period there where Parliament and the king got along well. But Charles dies and he is replaced by his brother, James II. And James is a lot like his grandfather, James I. He's kind of stubborn, determined kind of to restore the absolute monarchy. Here he is dressed for battle in the fashion of the day. But he makes a mistake. His first wife dies. His daughter marries William of Orange from the Netherlands. And he remarries, but he marries a Catholic that he had known in France. And now Parliament is very upset because they say, uh-oh, we're going to have problems because when he dies, we're going to have a Catholic king, and that's not going to be good. And so what the Parliament does is, under the reign of James II, they pull off what is known in English history as the Glorious Revolution. Okay? The Glorious Revolution is basically a setup. What Parliament does is they go to Mary, who is James's daughter, who is a confirmed Protestant, married to William of Orange, a confirmed Protestant, and basically say, okay, if we take care of this for you, will you be willing to be king and queen, joint sovereigns of England? And they both say, sure, we'll do that. And what happens is they land on the coast of England. James has his army ready to do battle. The British general moves out basically to discuss terms of the battle with the Dutch army that's there. And when he gets down there, he and his men turn around and face James I. Now, not a shot is fired. James immediately knows what's going on, jumps on his horse, rides all the way to Dover, gets on a ship, and lives the rest of his life in France. But the point here is, when you have this kind of a revolution, England is pretty much evolved to where they sit there on the verge of democracy. And the thing I want to kind of pull all into play here is, yeah, it's political, but it's religious as well. The whole founding of much of the United States has a very religious impact or religious aspect to it. Now, I want to say this about the Puritans and the Puritans that came to Massachusetts. They did not come to Massachusetts for freedom of religion. They came to Massachusetts for the freedom to practice their own religion, which is distinctly different from religious freedom. But all of these conflicts and so on that goes on in England are not only political in nature, they're very religious in nature. And when James makes the mistake of marrying a Catholic, he ends up losing his throne there. And then when William and Mary die, their daughter Anne takes over, and she is the last of the Stuart kings. They're replaced by what is now called the House of Windsor. They were actually from Germany. They were one of the cousins from Germany. And when George I comes in, Parliament really has its way because George couldn't even speak English in it. So you've got two things going on here. You've got the Protestant Reformation coming to England and wreaking a great deal of change, but you've also got it interminglingly, almost by accident, evolving into a full-fledged democracy. Now, England by no means is a full-fledged democracy at this point. I'll go back to this chart I had up here to the evolution of the English Constitution. And you can see here's Charles I in the Civil War. This is Cromwell in the Commonwealth. The restoration of Charles II. Let me see. Okay, here you have the Petition of Right that occurred under Charles, then the Civil War. Here's what I was looking for, the Glorious Revolution. It was the overthrow of James II, his replacement was William and Mary. The Convention Parliament drew up a Declaration of Rights. This is the English Bill of Rights. So, what you got out of the Glorious Revolution was the English Bill of Rights. This is in 1688. So 1628, you had the Petition of Right under Charles I. 1688, 68 years later, you get the English Bill of Rights, and then you basically have a strong degree of parliamentary control that went on. What eventually happens in England is you get an expansion of the franchise. Ireland becomes independent as its own separate nation, and for all intents and purposes, England becomes and evolves into a democracy. Now, where I'm going to wrap up with here is the American colonies of the British. Okay, and we'll go right here to Jamestown. Jamestown, named after King James. He was the king in 1607 when it was founded. And they came looking for gold and silver and, of course, found none. They were settled in the colony of Virginia, named after Queen Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen. She never married, never had any children. And so Jamestown is established there. They established it here because they were worried perhaps about a Spanish invasion, so their fort was built facing out so they could defend themselves. Turned out to be not such a good choice because it was a swamp and a lot of them died from malaria, yellow fever, etc. in it. Let me look here. Yes, look at Powhatan here. Trying to find, whoops, I'm not on the computer, better get to that. And this is a painting here. This is the Disney character here, Pocahontas. This is not John Smith. This is John Rolfe, the guy who she eventually married. The John Smith story, the only source on the John Smith story is John Smith. So you don't have any possible verification, though it's clear that there was some kind of relationship between Pocahontas and John Smith during that time period. She was converted to Christianity, and her nickname was, or her Christian name was Rebecca. And here's what I was looking for. This is not my favorite rendering of this, but this is a picture of Pocahontas when she went to England, where she was known as Lady Rebecca Rolfe within it. But I just go through that just in passing. But the real thing about Virginia was it's the beginning of the evolution of democracy here in the Americas. I'll go back here. The most important aspect of what eventually happened. Go back here. Those are the Anglo-Powhatan Wars. Go back one more. Virginia was settled by the Virginia Company, which means it was set up as a business as it went to turn a profit. And eventually it did, because John Rolfe is the guy that figured out how to domesticate tobacco. And it became America's first big cash crop. And so from 1607 to about 16, 17, 18, Virginia eventually became profitable. They didn't find any gold and silver, but they found a crop that was very good for their bottom line, because it happened to have very strong addictive qualities to it. But something very important happens in 1619. The Virginia Company, by this time, had become relatively profitable. But now you had more and more settlers. When you have more and more settlers, they have more and more needs. What do they need? Roads, postal system, a jail, courts, etc. And so if the Virginia Company is providing all of those services, they cost money, and it affects their bottom line. They're not making as much money. And so in 1619, they say to the citizens, the residents of Virginia, we are going to allow you to govern yourselves. The king is in charge here, of course, but you can govern yourself. So if you want a road, or if you want a sheriff, or if you want some judges, feel free to do so, but you pay for it yourself. Okay? This begins the concept of taxation with representation. That is, taxes were not imposed on Virginia by Parliament or by England. And of course, they weren't going to be doing that, because they're in their own religious conflict. They're about to have a civil war, then a military dictator, and then a restoration, and then another civil war. So this whole period of time is known as the period of benign neglect. That is, England's not paying much attention, but they're not giving any problems either. And what happens here is, beginning in 1619, the concept of self-governance takes place. Now, the American Revolution takes place in 1776 over the issue of taxation. They had been taxing themselves for a century and a half. And that's what we mean by benign neglect. The British didn't even know this was what was going on back here. They knew it, but they didn't realize the impact of it all. And so you get this evolution kind of behind the scenes. As democracy is evolving in England, it's evolving even to a greater degree in the English colonies. And then, of course, in 1620, those pilgrims show up. And before they land, and they didn't land first at Plymouth, they landed at Provincetown, out on the extreme tip of Cape Cod. And before they get off the boat, they sign the Mayflower Compact. Again, who signs it? Adult male church members. It's a theocracy. not a democracy at this point, but they say it is our intention to honor and be loyal to the king, blah, 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 but we intend to govern ourselves. And so from the very beginnings, this emerging English concept of self-governance, of limited monarchy, etc., takes hold to an even stronger degree in their colonies there. And then the colonies are able to avoid the kinds of religious conflicts that take place in Europe and in England. The southern colonies, they're Anglican. Church of England. Okay, they're the most uniform. But in Maryland, they're Catholics. They flee during the Civil War because they're getting it from both sides there. And as time evolves in Maryland, they start to notice that more and more Protestants are moving in and are worried about being outnumbered. So they passed the first act of religious tolerance, the Maryland Toleration Act, where any Christian can freely practice whatever religion they want within the confines of Maryland. Pretty interesting. Pennsylvania are Quakers, the most radical of Protestants. New York, New Jersey, they are Dutch Calvinists. And New England, Connecticut, Massachusetts, etc., are staunch Calvinists. But there is one little place, Rhode Island, founded by Roger Williams, which in the midst of the Civil War, he goes to England and he negotiates a charter for Rhode Island, which makes it almost entirely a self-governing colony. Now, he got it because the king was in the Civil War fighting the Protestants, the Puritans, and he thought by giving Williams all of this leeway, he could undermine the Puritans in New England. It did to a certain extent, but when he ended up being beheaded, it didn't matter all that much. But my point being here is the religious conflict, the political conflicts, and the inherent operation of the semi-democratic operation of the theocracies throughout the colonies ends up evolving into, by accident, by this strange combination of religious dissent, English evolution and democracy in the openness of frontier America to produce the beginnings of what we could honestly call democracy in the modern world. So what I'll do here is I'll stop this particular lecture. The next one, which will probably wrap us up, I'll talk to you about the Enlightenment, and we'll go into some detail on the West African slave trade. This is the last chapter in your text that you have to cover. So I'll sign off there, and I'll be back briefly with hopefully the last lecture of the year here.